Hi, I'm John Quinton, and in this mini lecture we're going to be talking about the soil carbon store and the soil carbon cycle. So we're going to start off with a couple of definitions. We use two terms quite commonly when we're talking about soil carbon, and those are soil organic matter and soil carbon itself. Soil organic matter is the fraction of soil that's made up from plant or animal tissue. It includes the soil microbial biomass that is in varied stages of decomposition. So all the bugs, the worms, and everything else that are turning over the soil or organic matter are included within that term. Soil carbon, on the other hand, is the element carbon. It's that fraction of the soil organic matter that is composed of that element. Soil organic matter is composed of lots of different elements. Life is made up of lots of different elements: nitrogen, phosphorus, oxygen, sulfur, to name but a few. But often we talk about soil carbon because that's the one that makes up the greatest percentage of that soil organic matter. So let's see where soils fit into the global carbon cycle. And I've got a schematic here, adapted from Brady and Val's book. You can find that online through the OneSearch app on the library's website. And you'll see that there are some pretty big stores with some pretty big numbers. The stores here we're talking about in petagrams, and the flows are in petagrams per year. So vast amounts of carbon moving around the globe. So what's interesting is if we look at the stores, what you'll see is that the two biggest ones are the carbonate rocks, such as limestone, the oceans and lakes of the world, and then the fossil fuel, which we're mining at a kind of a ferocious rate at the moment. But if we go to the kind of terrestrial carbon store, what we find is that soil is a really major component of that store, bigger actually than all the vegetation and the atmosphere combined. So there's much more carbon in soils than there is, for example, in the tropical rainforest. And then if you look at the flows, these stores are quite active. So there's a big flow from the atmosphere into vegetation, which flows through into the soil and then back out of the soil into the atmosphere. Okay, so this forms the basis for the soil carbon cycle. How big is it? Well, if we just take the UK alone, we have around about 10 billion tonnes of carbon locked up in our soils. So that's 15 tonnes for every person in the UK. Half of this is held in this kind of magical stuff called peat. Okay, and peat forms typically in cool places or very wet places, or better still, where it's cool and wet. So this is a picture taken from the North Pennines, and we've got probably about a metre and a half of peat here, formed up quite high, so it's quite cool most of the year, but also very wet, receives a lot of rainfall. And actually what we've got on the bottom here is some glacial till, which doesn't allow water to percolate through it. So the water sits on the top of that. The organic material falls on the soil surface, doesn't decompose well. So if we look at the distribution of soil carbon across the UK, it's not surprising that most of or the biggest carbon contents in the soil are found in the west of the country. So if you look in our part of the world where we're sitting up in Lancaster, the Northwest, Lake District, the Pennines you can pick out here, all have pretty high carbon contents, and that's largely because they're cool and they're wet. Same goes for Wales, and even parts of the southwest of England, particularly around Dartmoor, have highly organic soils. Now there are some outliers, such as in East Anglia, in the Fens, so some of these low-lying areas which have been historically waterlogged for many years have quite high soil organic carbon contents. If we look down a soil, so here's a plot of depth against soil organic carbon, what we find is that most of the carbon tends to be concentrated in the top 20 or 30 centimetres. And that's because that's where most of the plant activity takes place. So we have plants growing on the soil surface, they die, they return carbon to the soil, they also have their roots growing through this zone, and so there's a lot of biological activity associated with those roots, and as those roots die, they are returned to the soil in the form of soil organic matter. As you get deeper in the soil, you have fewer plant roots, and you also have less mixing of that soil with the soil above it. So we tend to see this kind of profile in an undisturbed grassland soil, such as the one in the photograph here. Let's have a little think about the composition of that soil organic matter. As I mentioned earlier, it's made up of living and dead material. So that living material might be plant roots, it might be bacteria, it might be earthworms, it might be invertebrates. And the dead material is largely plant remains. So this is plant remains that have either died and fell on the soil surface, or perhaps it's leaf litter, or it might be animal dung. So you might have animals grazing on plants and returning that organic matter to the soil. In terms of the kind of percent by weight, the plant remains are by far the most important, and you'll see the fractions here in the table I've put on this slide. So once you get beyond dead organic matter and plant roots, the other fractions are much smaller by weight. However, if you look at the numbers, they're quite mind-bogglingly large for some of the taxa there. So bacteria and fungi, there are literally quintillions and quadrillions of them. So you can, add 16 zeros on the end of that 8 to find out how big that number is. So absolutely huge numbers. And that's one of the reasons that soils are so important, because they hold this tremendous biodiversity, and we'll be talking about that in a later lecture. The other thing to point out is that this material is both fresh, so that, if I drop a leaf on the soil surface, that's pretty fresh, it's just fell on there, and it's also very old. So some of it has been there for maybe 1,000 years, because it's turning over very, very slowly and being decomposed very, very slowly. That peat soil that we saw in an earlier slide, much of that material has been there for hundreds, if not thousands of years. So this dead stuff, as I've mentioned, leaves, stalks, it is just the material that's going to be turned over as it dies. It varies with environment. So, for example, in a desert environment, you will have much less material coming into the soil than you would in a tropical rainforest, for example. There's also excrement, manures, compost, so these are from both wild animals but also from farm animals that are going to be defecating on the soil surface. Typically, it has a composition of carbon and nitrogen, which is in the ratio of about 11:1. It does vary a little bit, but typically it's that kind of ratio that we're usually looking at. So in terms of this live material, as I said, there's a whole range of different size animals that you might be looking at, from bacteria and fungi right up to protozoa, worms, etc. And I've just picked out a couple of really nice photographs here, one by Eric Palevsky and one by Sarah Blum. The first one shows a predatory mite feeding on a nematode. So this little blue stained worm here is indeed that, a worm. They can be very important for soils. They can also be, some nematodes can be pests that can feed on crops. And then this Colembula, which is kind of like a quite a cute little insect, very important for breaking down high carbon rich wood when it falls on the soil surface. Let's talk about the soil carbon cycle in a bit more detail. So I've got a diagram here of the soil carbon cycle. So let's just pick out the soil organic matter first of all. So this is the store. Yeah, this is where all that plant material, the dung from the animals, is going to be incorporated, and it includes what we often describe as humus, which is often well rot. What we would think of as quite well decomposed and quite stable material, and that contains the elements carbon, hydrogen, oxygen, nitrogen, phosphorus, and sulfur. Good way to remember those is chomps. Chomps. I'll try and say it again. So if you can remember that gives you the key elements that are part of this material. So we've talked a little bit about them, the inputs from the animals and from the plants. See those by the red arrows here. But then the microbial biomass is always trying to decompose and the carbon within the soil organic matter, and that subsumes oxygen from the soil air, but releases carbon dioxide into the soil air. So typically, carbon dioxide concentrations in the soil air are higher than they are in the surrounding atmosphere. As the microbes are carrying out these decomposition processes, they're releasing some of these elements in the forms of ions into the soil solution. So we've got cations here, calcium, magnesium, and potassium, which can be released quite quickly. And we've got the mineralization of nitrogen in the form of nitrate, phosphorus in the form of phosphate, and sulfur in the form of sulfate into the soil solution through slow mineralization. The plants can take up these ions, and by using them and photosynthesizing, they grow. And obviously this then helps to complete the cycle, and the organic matter, the plant remains, are returned to the soil. The final component is respiration by the roots, where the roots will be drawing in some carbon dioxide from the soil air and pushing out some oxygen to help replenish that's been taken up by the microbial biomass. understanding this, or at least understanding this soil carbon cycle, is really important for us to get to grips with, because obviously we want to be trying to think of ways of trying to sequester carbon into the soil and protect the carbon that we already have to help us in the fight against climate change. So what affects the speed of this cycle? So there are probably three key things, and I've got two of them on this slide. The first one is temperature. And like any chemical reaction, if you heat it up, it tends to go faster, and there's a bit of an exponential rise that goes with the increase in temperature. We have an increase in the relative rate of decomposition, and these are modelled numbers from a model, the Century model, and also another one called the Lloyd and Taylor model. But generally speaking, the thing to remember is that as you increase temperature, you get an exponential rise in the rate of decomposition. Soil moisture is a little bit more complicated. I mentioned that at high soil moisture rates, you have a low rate of decomposition. The same is true of very dry soils. Because there isn't much biological activity, those microbes need some moisture, but if they get too much, they drown. Okay, it becomes anaerobic, there's no oxygen, and anaerobic decomposition is a much, much slower process than aerobic decomposition. So we tend to think of the effect of soil moisture as a kind of bell-shaped curve. And so here you can see we've got soils which are saturated, roughly half of the pores saturated here, and then no pores with any water at this end of the scale. What's important here is to remember the shape of these curves. Okay, I'm not looking for you to know the exact numbers or even the models, but it is important to have some knowledge of the shape of these different curves. The other thing that we often think about as having an important influence over soil organic matter is the quality of the litter. So you can imagine that if you chop down a tree and you leave it on the soil surface to decompose, the bits that are going to be decomposed most readily are the leaves. Okay, so they're full of things that the microbes like to eat. They've got a lot of nitrogen in them compared to carbon, or a higher carbon to nitrogen ratio, I should say, whereas a lower carbon to nitrogen ratio. Let's get that right. So ratios in the order of perhaps 1 to 10, 1 to 15, whereas the woody material has a very high carbon to nitrogen ratio, perhaps 20 or 30 to 1. And you can see that the effect of that nitrogen is to increase the rate of loss of material from the plant remains. So in this experiment, or the Portillo and Estrada collected data from a series of European forests and grasslands and found that as the nitrogen content increased, the cumulative mass loss of material also increased. Okay, so the quality of the litter influences the speed of decomposition. The final thing which influences the speed of decomposition is how protected the organic matter is and how accessible it is to those microbes. So I've got a picture here, an electron micrograph of some soil, and we're really looking at tiny scales here, 2 microns across. So these pores are fractions of a micron across. So if you think of a bacteria, it's going to be about half the length of this bar. It's not going to be able to fit into these very small pores. So any organic molecules that are within those pores, and perhaps we can even make out a little bit of organic matter perhaps here, the bugs can't actually get inside to remove that material. And because these clays have such high surface areas, there can be quite a lot of organic matter which can be very well protected from decomposition just by this physical protection by the soil particles. I mentioned earlier that some organic material can be resident in the soil for hundreds, if not thousands of years. And here are some estimates of turnover time. I think it's important to stress that much of the soil organic matter turns over very quickly. And as we'll see in a later video, that's one of the reasons that it's actually quite hard to increase the organic matter content of a soil because it's decomposed quite rapidly. And so it's this material which is either protected in aggregates, such as the ones we've just looked at, that's often a material that's resident for much longer in the soil. Okay, even that woody material from a log or a tree trunk that's just been dropped on the soil surface, within probably 10 to 20 years, much of that material will have been decomposed and much of the carbon will have been released back to the atmosphere. So having this mineral component is very important if we're going to store carbon over longer time periods.